Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Bloody Divide, a chronicle of the Bleeding Kansas conflict by Just Stories. Chapter 1 Prologue. The roots of conflict. The Bleeding Kansas conflict did not emerge out of thin air. Rather, it was the result of deep-seated political and cultural divisions that had been simmering for years. These divisions were largely centered on the issue of slavery, which was becoming an increasingly contentious issue in the United States in the years leading up to the Civil War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed in 1854, was a major catalyst for the Bleeding Kansas conflict. This act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery in the northern territories of the United States. Instead, the Kansas-Nebraska Act established the principle of popular sovereignty, which allowed the residents of these territories to decide for themselves whether to allow or prohibit slavery. This decision was deeply controversial, as it opened up the possibility of slavery expanding into previously free territories. It also sparked a rush of settlers to the Kansas Territory, as both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces sought to establish a majority and sway the vote in their favor. These tensions were further fueled by the political and cultural differences between the North and South. The North was largely industrial and opposed to slavery, while the South was agricultural and depended on slave labor. This fundamental difference in worldview had been growing for decades, and the debate over slavery was the ultimate expression of this divide. As a result, the Kansas Territory became a battleground for these larger cultural and political forces. Both sides were determined to establish dominance, and this led to increasingly violent confrontations between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The Bleeding Kansas conflict was not just a local skirmish, but a microcosm of the larger struggle for the soul of the nation. The outcome of this conflict would have far-reaching implications for the future of the United States, and the debates over slavery would continue to shape the country's politics for years to come. In conclusion, the Prologue of The Bloody Divide, a chronicle of the Bleeding Kansas conflict, sets the stage for the conflict by examining the larger cultural and political forces that were driving the tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in the years leading up to the Civil War. It provides a broader context for understanding the events that unfolded in Kansas and the larger implications of this conflict for the future of the United States. Chapter 2 Border Ruffians and Free Staters. The Bleeding Kansas conflict was marked by the clash between two opposing groups, the pro-slavery Border Ruffians and the anti-slavery Free Staters. These two groups were deeply divided over the issue of slavery and their competing visions for the future of Kansas. The Border Ruffians were primarily residents of Missouri who crossed the border into Kansas to support the spread of slavery. They were known for their violent tactics and intimidation of anti-slavery settlers. The Border Ruffians saw Kansas as an extension of the slaveholding South and were determined to ensure that the territory became a slave state. On the other hand, the Free Staters were anti-slavery settlers who had come to Kansas with the goal of preventing the spread of slavery. They believed that Kansas should be a free state and were willing to use force to defend their position. The Free Staters were often outnumbered and outgunned by the Border Ruffians, but they were determined to stand their ground. The conflict between these two groups quickly became violent. In 1855, the first election in Kansas was marked by widespread fraud and violence as Border Ruffians from Missouri crossed the border to vote illegally in favor of pro-slavery candidates. This election was a turning point in the conflict, as it demonstrated the willingness of the pro-slavery forces to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. The violence continued to escalate in the following years, with both sides engaging in raids, arson, and murder. The Border Ruffians burned down anti-slavery towns and destroyed homes and businesses, while the Free Staters retaliated with their own attacks. The conflict reached a fever pitch in 1856, when the town of Lawrence, a Free Stater stronghold, was sacked by a mob of Border Ruffians. Despite the violence and bloodshed, both sides remained committed to their cause. The Border Ruffians believed that they were defending the institution of slavery and the economic interests of the South, while the Free Staters saw themselves as defending the principles of freedom and democracy. This clash of ideologies was at the heart of the conflict, and it would take years of violence and political maneuvering before a resolution was reached. In conclusion, the conflict between the Border Ruffians and the Free Staters was the central struggle of the Bleeding Kansas conflict. These two groups represented the competing visions for the future of Kansas and the larger debate over the institution of slavery in the United States. The violence and bloodshed that resulted from this clash of ideologies would have profound consequences for the country's future. Chapter 3: The Wakarusa War. The Wakarusa War was a pivotal moment in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It was a violent confrontation between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces that nearly escalated into a full-scale war. The conflict began in November 1855, when a Free Stater named Charles Dow was murdered by a pro-slavery supporter. This event sparked outrage among the anti-slavery settlers, who demanded that the murderer be brought to justice. When the local authorities failed to act, the Free Staters organized a meeting and elected Samuel Jones as their leader. Jones was a controversial figure, known for his aggressive tactics and willingness to use force to defend the anti-slavery cause. He quickly began organizing a militia and calling for the ouster of all pro-slavery settlers from the area. This move was seen as a direct challenge to the pro-slavery forces, who responded by organizing their own militia. The two sides quickly began to clash, with skirmishes breaking out across the region. The violence continued to escalate until a full-scale confrontation took place at the Wakarusa River. The pro-slavery forces had barricaded themselves on the south side of the river, while the Free Staters had taken up positions on the north side. For several days, the two sides faced off, with neither willing to back down. The situation was tense, and it looked as though the conflict might spiral out of control. Finally, a peace agreement was reached, with both sides agreeing to disarm and allow an outside mediator to resolve the dispute. The Wakarusa War had a significant impact on the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It demonstrated the deep-seated divisions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces and the willingness of both sides to resort to violence to achieve their goals. It also highlighted the weaknesses of the territorial government, which was unable to prevent or resolve the conflict. The Wakarusa War also had wider implications for the country as a whole. It was seen as a foreshadowing of the larger conflict that was brewing between the North and South over the issue of slavery. It showed that the issue could not be resolved peacefully and that a violent struggle was inevitable. In conclusion, the Wakarusa War was a key moment in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It demonstrated the intensity of the conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces and the willingness of both sides to resort to violence. It also highlighted the weaknesses of the territorial government and the wider implications of the conflict for the future of the United States. Chapter 4: The Sack of Lawrence. The Sack of Lawrence was one of the most significant events in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It was a violent attack on the Free Stater stronghold of Lawrence by a group of pro-slavery forces. The conflict began when the Free Staters established a government in Lawrence, which was seen as a direct challenge to the territorial government that was controlled by the pro-slavery forces. In response, the territorial governor, Wilson Shannon, issued a proclamation declaring that the Free Stater government was illegal. The pro-slavery forces, led by Sheriff Samuel Jones, then organized a posse to enforce the governor's proclamation. They marched on Lawrence with the intention of dismantling the Free Stater government and arresting its leaders. When they arrived in Lawrence, they found that the Free Staters had armed themselves and were prepared to defend their town. However, they were vastly outnumbered by the pro-slavery forces, who had brought with them a cannon. The pro-slavery forces began shelling the town, setting fire to buildings and destroying property. They also looted homes and businesses, stealing valuables and destroying anything that they could not carry away. The attack lasted for several hours, until the pro-slavery forces had completely destroyed much of the town. The sack of Lawrence was a devastating blow to the Free Stater cause. It showed that the pro-slavery forces were willing to use extreme violence to achieve their goals and that the territorial government was unable or unwilling to prevent such attacks. It also galvanized anti-slavery sentiment across the country and helped to bring the issue of slavery to the forefront of national politics. The sack of Lawrence had wider implications for the future of the United States. It was seen as a precursor to the larger conflict that would erupt between the North and South over the issue of slavery. It also demonstrated the growing polarization of American society and the inability of political institutions to resolve the issue peacefully. In conclusion, the sack of Lawrence was a significant event in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It was a violent attack on the Free Staters' stronghold of Lawrence by pro-slavery forces, which demonstrated the deep-seated divisions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The attack had wider implications for the future of the country, highlighting the growing polarization of American society and the inability of political institutions to resolve the issue of slavery peacefully. Chapter 5: The Potawatomi Massacre. The Potawatomi Massacre was a violent act of retribution carried out by John Brown and a group of anti-slavery settlers against pro-slavery forces in Kansas. The massacre was a response to the sack of Lawrence and other violent attacks on Free Stater settlements in the region. In May 1856, John Brown and his followers, who called themselves the Potawatomi Rifles, rode to the pro-slavery settlement of Potawatomi Creek. There, they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes and brutally murdered them with swords and hatchets. The victims included James Doyle, Drury Doyle, William Sherman, Allen Wilkinson, and William Sherman's teenage son. The Potawatomi Massacre was a shocking and brutal act of violence that horrified both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. It marked a turning point in the Bleeding Kansas conflict, as it demonstrated the willingness of anti-slavery forces to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. The Potawatomi Massacre also had wider implications for the future of the country. It galvanized both pro-slavery and anti-slavery sentiment, fueling the growing polarization of American society. It also helped to bring the issue of slavery to the forefront of national politics and helped to push the country closer to the brink of civil war. John Brown became a controversial figure as a result of the Potawatomi Massacre. Some saw him as a hero who had taken a bold stand against the pro-slavery forces, while others saw him as a dangerous extremist who had committed a heinous act of violence. The Potawatomi Massacre marked a significant turning point in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It demonstrated the deep-seated divisions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces and the willingness of both sides to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. It also had wider implications for the future of the country, highlighting the growing polarization of American society and the looming threat of civil war. In conclusion, the Potawatomi Massacre was a brutal and shocking act of violence that marked a turning point in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It demonstrated the intensity of the conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces and had wider implications for the future of the country. The massacre helped to bring the issue of slavery to the forefront of national politics and pushed the country closer to the brink of civil war. Chapter 6: The Battle of Osawatomi. The Battle of Osawatomi was a significant engagement in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It was fought between anti-slavery Free Staters, led by John Brown, and pro-slavery Border Ruffians on August 30, 1856. John Brown, who had gained notoriety for his role in the Potawatomi Massacre, had established a stronghold in the town of Osawatomi. The town had become a center of Free Stater activity and a frequent target of pro-slavery forces. On August 30th, a group of around 300 pro-slavery Border Ruffians attacked Osawatomi. The Free Staters, numbering only around 40 men, were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Nevertheless, they put up a fierce resistance, fighting from behind makeshift barricades. The battle was intense and lasted for several hours. The Free Staters fought bravely but were ultimately overwhelmed by the superior numbers of the pro-slavery forces. John Brown himself was wounded in the fighting, but he managed to escape with some of his men. The Battle of Osawatomi was a significant defeat for the Free Staters, who suffered heavy casualties. It also demonstrated the willingness of pro-slavery forces to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. However, the Battle of Osawatomi also had wider implications for the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It showed that the Free Staters were willing to fight back against the pro-slavery forces, despite their inferior numbers and resources. It also helped to galvanize anti-slavery sentiment across the country and bring the issue of slavery to the forefront of national politics. John Brown's role in the Battle of Osawatomi further cemented his reputation as a fierce anti-slavery fighter. His exploits in Kansas helped to make him a symbol of the growing abolitionist movement in the North and an inspiration to other anti-slavery activists. In conclusion, the Battle of Osawatomi was a significant engagement in the Bleeding Kansas conflict. It demonstrated the willingness of pro-slavery forces to use extreme violence to achieve their goals and the determination of Free Staters to resist. The battle also had wider implications for the future of the country, highlighting the growing polarization of American society and the looming threat of civil war. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next story.